Hey guys, in this section, we're going to be learning about the Bootstrap framework. And this is one of many external CSS layout systems. But this is probably one of the most popular and the one that you're most likely to come across out in the wild. Bootstrap, as I said, is a CSS framework created in 2010 by two Twitter developers, Mark Otto and Jacob Thornton. Now, the power of Bootstrap and the reason why it became so popular is it contained pre-made CSS files, which you can simply include into your project in order to use their pre-built components and styling. For example, if you wanted to have some tags in your website, you could create a look like this by simply adding a few classes to your HTML. On top of that, one of the biggest reasons why Bootstrap took off is because of their 12-column layout system built on top of Flexbox that makes it really easy to create responsive websites and websites that simply just work and look great on mobile as well as desktop. The so-called mobile-first approach. So how exactly does it work? Well, let's say you had a button which just said home. You can see that the standard button rendered from HTML doesn't look fantastic. But if we included just 5 classes which come from the Bootstrap CSS, so we include the pre-built CSS into our project and we add the styling and the components by adding these classes to our HTML, then all of a sudden what you'll end up with is something that looks beautiful and pre-styled like this. And because we don't have to worry about writing all of the CSS code, all we need to know is which classes we need to add to our HTML. Then it makes everything so much easier and so much quicker when we want to build components into our website. Now, as I mentioned, Bootstrap is a type of CSS framework. What exactly are these? Well, they're pre-made CSS files which you can include into your projects. If we had a look at the Bootstrap GitHub, and because Bootstrap is completely open source, then all of the code is visible. And you can see it's got styling defined for all of the different components. For example, this is inside the card component, and it's got classes that define what a card body should look like, what kind of layout it should have, what kind of color it should have, as well as what the card title should look like, subtitle, and it's got all of this predefined CSS, which we can simply insert straight into our HTML. Now, the two most popular external CSS frameworks are Bootstrap and Foundation, but there are lots more like MUI and Tailwind and a whole bunch more. And the reason why they're so great is because they allow us to add in pre-built components and develop websites quickly and efficiently. If we look at the usage percentages across the internet, you can see that the biggest CSS external framework is still Bootstrap, with close to 80% of the market share. But just because we learn about Bootstrap, it doesn't mean that everything we learned about CSS is null and void. In fact, if you look at the top here, when we look at the absolute usage percentages of all of the different frameworks across the internet, you can see the largest percentage are still websites that don't use any external CSS frameworks. What does it mean when there are no CSS frameworks being used? Well, it means you're probably using native CSS like Flexbox and Grid and Float and all of the great things that we learned before. So Bootstrap doesn't replace any of that knowledge. And in fact, we should be in a situation where we don't actually need to depend on any sort of external framework. But they are really useful when we want to develop websites quickly and easily, and we don't want to spend a ton of time designing our websites, because it comes with all of the pre-made styling and all of the styling rules that we can easily conform to by using their components. So what are the pros of external CSS frameworks? Well, they're easy and they're fast to use. And you get a ton of pre-built components like this pricing plan, which took us ages to build ourselves. And you also get really consistent styling across your website. It's almost like you hired a professional developer who kept everything looking on brand. And finally, you have really good browser compatibility because they've tested all of the different browsers, Safari, Chrome, Brave, and whichever browsers that your user might be using, so you don't actually have to do all of this complicated testing. You can just trust that it works out of the box. Now, what are some of the downsides of CSS frameworks? Well, one of the biggest downsides is something called class bloat. Remember previously we mentioned that it's a really good idea to separate structure from style, where we said that HTML is for structure, so adding in elements that describe what the purpose is, and CSS is for style. Using external CSS frameworks, because we're adding everything into the classes, then very quickly you end up with what's called class bloat, where you have a lot of styling going into the actual HTML file. And it looks a lot less clean than if we had just used something like Grid or Flexbox, where we have all of our predefined classes and we go easy on the classes that we add into our HTML file. The other downside is customization. If you want to build a website where you want to have full control over every pixel and layout and everything to be exactly the way you designed it, then external CSS frameworks is probably not the way to go. Because in order to customize each and every component, it can be really time consuming. So when should you use these CSS frameworks like Bootstrap and when should you not? Well, when you are building a mobile-first, responsive website that you want to put online very quickly and access beautiful components designed by professional designers, keeping everything on your website looking slick and uniform, then you probably want to consider using Bootstrap. But if you're building a very simple website where you just need HTML and CSS and you can quickly throw it up, or if you're building a really complex custom design website and you want complete control over the design, then it's probably not a good idea to use an external CSS framework like Bootstrap. So we've spoken so much about the pros and cons, when to use, when not to use, but how do you actually use it? Well, one of the easiest ways is to include it via a CDN link. We've seen how we can use the link tag in order to add our style sheets. And in a similar way, we can use these link tags that simply gets hold of the style sheet from an external resource. So in this case, it's through a CDN, which stands for Content Delivery Network. And what these are is little hubs all across the entire world, and it knows where your users are located. So when they load up your website and try to access this particular CSS file that contains all of the Bootstrap code, then it can find the closest location with the shortest distance to the server that has that content. And that just means that even though this has to be downloaded from somewhere, it can be delivered to your user and rendered very, very quickly. And from our point of view as developers, all we need to do is simply include this link into the head section of our HTML. And if we want any of the functionality like drop-down menus or clickable buttons, then we want to include the Bootstrap script just before the end of the body section. So somewhere right about here. Now let's go ahead and try an exercise and see if we can upgrade our website quickly by using Bootstrap. Download 11.0 Bootstrap Intro, and if you open it inside of VS Code, open the index.html, you can see there are 4 to-dos for you to complete. And once you've completed all of these 4 steps, you should end up with a card that displays a sunflower image. And this is one of the pre-built Bootstrap components. Now, how are you going to do this? Well, firstly, you can head over to getbootstrap.com, which is the main Bootstrap website. And then I want you to include the Bootstrap files using CDN. You only need the CSS file through this link element for now. And then I want you to go into the documentation if you want to look up anything regarding the card component, which is all the way down here in components under the card section. Now, you know what the goal should look like. You've got all of the resources to get started, and you should be able to work through each of the to-dos one by one. pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, hopefully you've given that a go and you've seen that the Bootstrap card has some example code which you can straight up just drop into your file. If you haven't given this a go, pause the video now, don't continue, because things will get harder and harder as we go on in the course. And if you just watch the videos, eventually at some point, things are not going to make sense because you haven't had the practice. Make things easy for your future self by putting in lots of effort and practice now. All right, enough said. First thing, let's walk through the solution together, and hopefully you can check it against your work. Now, the first thing we're going to do is add the Bootstrap link, which comes from the home page, and we just want this first link that is going to include the style sheet. And you can see this is a link with a relationship or style sheet. So instead of using our own style sheet, we're now using the Bootstrap CSS. And if you're wondering what that min stands for, it's basically a file where all of the spaces are taken away so that it's as short as possible. So it loads up quicker because there's no spaces and everything's all jumbled, which is impossible for humans to read, but it works just fine for the computer. To do number 2 is to add the Bootstrap pre-built card. So if we go into our docs and find our card component, you can see the first example is pretty much the card we want to build. If we look at the goal, we've got our card title, some example text, a button, and an image. And this is exactly the same as this example. So let's copy the HTML and paste it into here under to do number 2. Now let's check our work. Let's show it in preview and see what it looks like. It looks pretty good other than the fact that the image is pretty much completely broken. So step 3 is to change the image source to display the flower JPEG image. The image is right here. And right now the source is completely empty because it's an example. Let's go ahead and change it to our image, which is flower.jpg. You see it show up immediately. And as always with images, let's add a alt text so that people with screen readers know what it's all about. All right, now the final step is a little bit of a revision step because I wanted you to use Flexbox to center the card in the vertical and horizontal center. If we take a look at this URL on our browser, you can see it's stuck all the way to the top left, which is default HTML layout. But if we want it right here in the middle, then we're going to need to use some Flexbox magic. And we're going to do that inside an internal style element right here under to do number 4. What do we need to target? Well, we need to target the entire card, and the topmost level is this Flex container. The reason why it's of class Flex container is because this comes from the Bootstrap CSS, and it's got some styling in there that defines that container, but we can always override it. And this is really, really important. When we want to override a particular Bootstrap style, we have to make sure that it's more specific. So either it goes inside an internal style element, or it goes inside an inline style property, or if we're using our standard external CSS and we use a link linking to, I don't know, say /CSS/style.css, and we have a style.css file somewhere in our project, then you got to make sure that your custom CSS file occurs below the Bootstrap link. That way, this is first looked at, and then the browser looks at your custom style sheet, and you can override any of the classes that come from Bootstrap. So this is an important point to remember for the future when you're creating your own custom style sheets. All right, so now in order to override the style here, now we might be building on top of existing Bootstrap styles, or we might be specifying something they don't even care about and it's not defined in the Bootstrap CSS at all. In our case, we want to change this Flex container to display Flex because we know that this is one of the simplest ways to center anything in CSS. And the first thing we need to change is the justify content, set to center, And the second one is align items set to center. And finally, we need to make sure that the entire container takes up the full height and not just some proportion of the height that's enough for the content. So let's set the height to 100 viewport height. And now you can see our card is perfectly centered in the middle using Flexbox. It's a component that we've borrowed and customized from Bootstrap, and you can see how easy it was and quick to create this layout by leveraging the power of Bootstrap. In the next lesson, we're going to dive deeper into Bootstrap, and we're going to look at how the Bootstrap 12-column layout system actually works in practice. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson.